so we can have access to them as long as all the speakers are okay with that, so we'll deal with them first. So with this session, we're going to change the format a little bit. Instead of presentations, we decided to do a moderated panel. We have a fantastic group of compliance and ethics experts here, and Serina Vash will be moderating it. Serina is the executive director of the corporate compliance program at NYU Law, and so she straddles both the legal world and the compliance world, and is a former prosecutor, so she's going to bring fantastic perspective in moderating this discussion. So I'll turn the floor to her.
Thanks, Azish, and thank you to Azish and Jeremy for putting this fantastic panel together for me to moderate. So the Plenary 3 is getting in gear, ethics as a driver of compliance. And we are going to talk about the varied behavioral challenges that compliance officers face, how compliance and ethics professionals do their job more efficiently and effectively using cumulative knowledge from the field of behavioral compliance. And in our discussion, we're going to learn strategies that are employed by a range of companies as well as the latest trends impacting the compliance industry. I have three fantastic panelists. Directly to my left is Jeff Kaplan, who's a partner at Kaplan and Walker. Mr. Kaplan specializes in all aspects of assisting companies in developing, implementing, and reviewing corporate compliance and ethics programs, including conducting risk analyses, writing, editing codes of conduct, and other policy documents. Directly next to him is Professor Donald Langevoort. He's the Thomas Aquinas Reynolds Professor of Law at Georgetown School of Law. His area of expertise is business organizations, securities regulations, psychology, and psychiatry. And his new book is Selling Hope, Selling Risk, Corporations, Wall Street, and the Dilemmas of Investor Protection, which has just been published by Oxford University Press this year. Directly to his left, Carsten Tams is the Senior Vice President, Ethics and Compliance Officer at Bertelsmann. Carsten joined Bertelsmann in 2000 and has served in his current position since January 2008 in charge of ethics and compliance. In this capacity, he's responsible for introducing and overseeing a global ethics and compliance program. And his work focuses on a variety of initiatives in the areas of corporate culture, HR policy, organizational development, and corporate responsibility. So I wanted to start by something that I heard from our last one of our last panelists, Elizabeth Morrison. I loved what she said. She said, behavior is the foundation of culture. So let's talk a little bit about behavioral compliance, behavioral ethics, and I'm going to ask Professor Langevoort to talk a little bit about the difference between those two things.
Sure, or the connection between the two things. Yeah, I regard behavioral ethics as a term of art that is widely used to describe the academic research you've been hearing about all morning, which is from a variety of disciplines, organizational behavior usually being the umbrella, to understand better how people make choices in economic environments that are ethically fraught, that have some kind of ethical dimension. Compliance is a field, a subject within business and law about how you optimize or manage the risk associated with legal violations. When you unite the two, you're essentially saying we can learn from category 1 to help category 2. That what we know about ethics, what we know about how to communicate with people, how to nudge them, may get you to be a better compliance risk manager. And therefore, when you unite the two phrases, you're really saying compliance people have an awful lot to learn. And we've only scratched the surface today about what that learning could be.
Thank you. One of the ways we thought we would structure this is talk a little bit about what conventional wisdoms are, what people generally believe, and whether they're accurate or inaccurate based on what the research shows. We're starting to talk about situational factors that influence decisions, people's decisions, employees' decisions to cheat or act unethically. So what are some of the situational factors that influence decisions by employees to cheat or act unethically? I'm going to start with a conventional wisdom that that I actually went in as a prosecutor believing, sort of bad things are committed by, bad acts are committed by bad people, right? Bad people commit bad acts. Good people commit good acts. And I assumed I would sit across the table from somebody, and I assumed that I would find out what was it that motivated that person to commit that bad act. And I assumed that that person across the table was probably not at all like me, but probably was very dissimilar. And I found every single time something a little bit different. So let's talk about a conventional wisdom that business crime is based largely on rational calculations by evil individuals. Actors. Jeff Kaplan has said, I was drawn to this work after being struck by how the traditional view of business crime as based largely on rational calculations by evil individuals often bore little resemblance to the actual cases with which I was familiar. So, Jeff, talk a little bit about research, talk a little bit about what you found is actually what business crime really is based on.
Well, first of all, just a brief historical note, which is the very first compliance-related conference, as far as I know, in the U.S. was actually held here in Stern in April 1990. And so it's fascinating to me to see how far the field has come in those 26 years. But I also think that, copy what Professor Langevoort said, we've just scratched the surface. And that the learning that can be done, whether it's behavioral ethics related or otherwise, is not even close to seeing its best days. So I had the same experience that Serina had in terms of expecting people to be different. And it was interesting because it was crystallized in a case that unfortunately I never found a good historical record of, but in the 1980s there were a series of prosecutions around the country because it was a national industry, about a certain type of fraud that had taken place in the sale of what is called specialty steel to energy companies building nuclear power plants and fossil fuel refineries and so forth. And what came out of this prosecution was the fact that nationwide for really 40 years, pretty much, if not everybody, a very large percentage of the people in this industry were engaged in this fraud. And it was sort of like a mega version of what gets shown in these behavioral ethics experiments. And that sort of blew up for me in a way that had already started, the notion of evil individuals rationally calculating gain versus risk. And because of that, I was drawn to reading. Now, in terms of the studies, in a way, I shouldn't say all of them, but most of them prove the point that Serina just mentioned. To me, though, and I'm sorry if somebody already mentioned this from the podium today and I missed it, but sort of the mother of all these studies is one that happened with one that took place in Princeton Theological Seminary, where, and I'm going to grossly oversimplify this, subjects of the experiment were found 6 times more likely to stop to help somebody in distress when they were told, there was no time pressure facing them on their route, which is all sort of constructed. And so it was not a small issue. There was somebody who looked like, I guess he was having a heart attack or something equally dire, and yet 6 times as many people walked by when they were told they were late for something, for some appointment. And that's just an astounding result. And in a way, I've yet to find the result of an experiment that has that much impact for what it represents. And when I speak to companies, that's the case I talk about. But there are lots and lots of others. Certainly stress, time pressure is a factor. Another factor, which I've seen a lot of and was actually present in this specialty pipe case, is if the people who were had the ethical issue, the actors, didn't know who their misconduct might be affecting. If there was, I think somebody's called this victim distance, and so in this industry, when you sold to somebody, they were buying it on a cost-plus basis, and they passed that on to somebody else. And so what I found from talking to people in the industry is they said, well, we're not sure anyone's really been hurt. We don't know who it is. It's all just, we don't know. And I think that some variation on that, whether it's in the securities field or in defense contracting or lots of other areas where you don't have a victim, that's another set of circumstances. And actually, just one last quote. the father of all this, in a way, or the insight that, in a way, is the father of all this, comes from Benjamin Franklin, who said that there is no form of, and this is a paraphrase, not a quote, wrongdoing that good people will so easily fall into as cheating the government, or words to that effect. And that's, you know, it's like 18-something. So those are a few.
Thanks, thank you. And next, conventional wisdom, I'm going to ask Professor Langevoort. Is this idea that requiring people to disclose conflicts of interest will lead to greater ethical decision-making and a more compliant culture? Talk a little bit about requiring people to disclose conflicts of interest.
Well, this is one very good example where compliance could learn a lot from the behavioral ethics literature. As many of you in the room know, the question of whether people become more or less opportunistic after the disclosure of conflict is well studied. And the main inference that people draw, that researchers draw, is that the discloser, the person making disclosure, actually feels a greater license to become aggressive. I've disclosed. I've warned the person. It's now their fault. You're blaming the victim. There are second-level effects that those who hear disclosure of the conflict of interest may infer that, hey, this person is voluntarily doing this, they must be a good person. Or what's called insinuation anxiety. I don't want this person whom I like to think I don't trust them. So I'm going to actually obey more. Okay, that's an emerging body of research. What could a compliance person do with that? Well, this is where my field comes into play. I work with brokerage firms. You have financial advisors across the table, across an email account, constantly interacting with compliance/legal, however you want to slice and dice that, saying, of course, here are the mandatory disclosures. And I hear the registered reps, the financial advisors talking all the time, oh, they know, customer, client knows that there are these revenue streams being funneled to us to promote these products, because look, it's in the brochure. The moral wiggle room, to use another common phrase, available to a financial advisor who is able to convince himself, herself, that all is well because it's all disclosed, is probably one of the biggest door openers to pushing hard, especially on senior investors. And that introduces 3 more cognitive wrinkles. So, yeah, it's a great example. If indeed these laboratory results, these observations are correct, what a compliance officer would do in looking for things that will lead to sales practice abuse becomes so much more vivid than if you adopt the rational actor model that everybody behaves on a cost-benefit basis.
So conventional wisdom number 3, we talked a lot about this morning, tone at the top. Carsten, tone at the top bias. Leaders are the key to instilling ethical behavior throughout the organization.
I think there's definitely a strong bias towards, you can call it tone at the top or trickle-down ethics in the compliance arena. This idea that senior management sets the rules, defines the code of conduct, and through communication, tone from the top, zero tolerance messaging, drives values, drives rules throughout the organization, aligns employees with these rules, and so on and so forth. It just raises, in my view, a number of questions. The first question is what instills this hope, this confidence in us that the senior leaders of an organization are somehow ethically more qualified than the rest of us to be, to provide that kind of guidance and direction. After all, they're confronted with the greatest incentives. they have potentially the most to gain from stretching or breaking rules. They have the greatest discretion, leeway to influence decisions. They are also probably the most savvy, intellectually capable to pull off a scheme. That would be my first concern, is that the risks, the compliance risks don't really sit at the bottom of the organization. The greatest risks sit at the top due to incentive structures and what have you. My second question would be this confidence and optimism about value engineering, let's put it that way. This idea that leaders can go through the organization, drive values through the organization. My understanding from the literature about motivation, how values and norms are assimilated or introjected, as some people call it, is that this is a very subtle psychological process. And certainly any form of top-down pressure is not conducive to that. Deshi and Ryan, founders of self-determination theory that influences my work and thinking a lot, suggests that three basic psychological needs need to be satisfied or supported in order to increase this chance that people will internalize external norms, which are, number one, they need to feel autonomous. So the internalization of the norm has to feel volitional rather than pressured. Secondly, they need to feel competent. They need to feel that they can actually perform the demand that is articulated through the norm. And lastly, they feel safe, related to the organization or the social environment that postulates social norms. My sense is that in compliance, we pretty much do the exact opposite. We determine the rules from top down, and we pressure them down into the organization, and we try to incentivize people through threat of punishment. And more recently now, the most en vogue idea is to provide carrots for good ethical behavior. So all of this attempts to externally control and align people with organizational values. So those would be my two key criticisms of this trickle-down approach to managing values.
Add one thought, which is that there's a fair bit of interesting behavioral ethics research on the vulnerability of people in power to wrongdoing. And the other is that, and here we getting into what do you do with the information from a compliance perspective. One of the hardest things to do in companies is get the companies to focus on the risks of senior people, particular risks of senior people doing wrong. And I had an experience with a company that had done a great job focusing on the compliance risks of everybody else, but wasn't focusing on theirs. So I made it my specific recommendation. You should do a risk assessment of your senior people, period. Now, I think they're going to do it. If they do, I won't be able to report back because I'm going to get into the attorney-client privilege. But I think that it's key to really do that, because part of what makes senior people risky is that they're arrogant and less likely to accept a compliance regime that actually, there was a statement by, to paraphrase Leona Helmsley, they feel that ethics are for the little people. And that's a real danger in companies. It needs to be addressed by compliance.
And if I may add, it was this country, people in this country who invented, if you will, the alternative model, which is trickle-up governance, if you want to call it that. And that goes back to Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. People like that who believed that the best way to guard against corruption, fraud, and self-dealing, in that case in government, the best antidote is to bring in people and have governance buy-in through the people. And I think this is it seems maybe a very radical idea, but I think it's something that is overlooked in the compliance field. Surprisingly so, because actually criminology has paid a lot of attention to this idea. There's a concept of collective efficacy, and which proposes that the neighbors, the residents within a community, through their informal social control can actually contribute greatly towards the sustaining shared social norms and drive out and reduce crime in the neighborhoods. And I think that's a topic that is almost entirely ignored to this day in our profession, and one that I'm very personally interested in looking into.
Excellent, thank you so much. I would also like to ask you, Professor Langevoort, in terms of understanding the way an ordinary employee would make a decision, is acting ethically harder or easier than cutting corners or, stepping over the line? Not you personally.
Right.
It's your view of how others think.
And obviously somebody should ask John this question, because that's his research, not his experience, I assume. But yeah, a body of behavioral ethics research suggests that the impulses, what's going on in our brains, that are want or desire oriented, and cheating resides there, are more automatic than the deliberative process that ethical reasoning takes. And so in terms of speed of mental processing or things like that, bet on the want. So to some extent, compliance and ethics, which is much about timing and things like that, getting involved, sending messages at the right point, just as the stresses are growing, is another one of those many messages that the research offers us. A more pessimistic message, and one I've stressed a lot, and there's the word stress, that tiredness, stress, depletion, all of that stuff that is because of the deliberative nature of the process wears you down and makes you, and being worn down by stress, by tiredness, by depletion, will make cheating more likely. I love to say that and then ask a group of people in the field, is there any stress around here in this organization? Because when they see it that way, the effect of what is the reality of the workplace today, no matter how fair you try to make the workplace, it does tend to be a 14-hour-a-day task in what is perceived and imagined to be a highly competitive environment in which there is great fear about not performing. And that's depletion. So it's another thing of the many things for compliance people to put on their list to worry about.
And if I just could add, the particular list of things to worry about that I would put that on if I was a compliance officer is the risk assessment list.
Yeah.
And I think that, identifying parts of a business, whether it's geographic, business unit, function, or some other that's under particular stresses, is something that can be immensely valuable if you do it in a risk assessment, because if you do it in a risk assessment, somebody's going to have to do something with the information. It's not just a problem, it's not just amusing, it becomes an action item. And I think that's actually true with a lot of the compliance, with a lot of the behavioral ethics findings, the insights, the ideas, that they find their natural home, at least as a place to grow and become useful within a risk assessment. And it becomes harder to ignore. Risk assessments often are seen by boards of directors, so they'll want to focus on that. But particularly this one of stress, particularly because it's going to keep growing. As there are more and more economic headwinds of companies operating globally, the stress factor, the pressure will only become worse. And so making sure that's an action item in your compliance program, I think, is critically important.
Yeah, let me ask you the corollary question. How does competition affect ethical behavior, Jeff, in your...
It's also on my risk assessment. When I assess risks, I do, there's sort of general questions, then there are ones about specific areas like antitrust, like others. But certainly being under a lot of pressure, and this and pressure to keep business as opposed to maybe get business, and that gets the loss aversion. I think that what I see, an intense amount of competition is something which adds to risk. Now, on the other hand, if you have no competition, then you've got a different kind of risk, a monopoly risk. So there's no sort of straight line you can draw here, but I would put both that as mostly a risk-enhancing factor.
And Professor Langevoort, can you talk a little bit about loss aversion? Jeff just mentioned loss aversion. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and again, what we're doing is creating a list for you of these things that are fairly well studied in the behavioral ethics literature that seem to have some bite when it comes to the risk of misbehavior. Loss aversion is a complicated matter, but to simplify it, and this is directly from the Kahneman-Tversky line of research, that although we will take a certain level of risk in the face of a perceived gain, we'll take a larger risk to avoid the equivalent loss. And gain and loss, any economist will tell us, are really mirror images. They're a matter of framing. But that if you come to perceive yourself as, we're going to lose blank, could be access to external funding from a bank, it could be any number of things. The reaction to that in terms of how aggressive you're willing to be ethically, legally, and everything else is greater. There's a nice recent survey article of many examples of business misconduct, all through a loss aversion frame. I think something like 54 identified instances. But, you know, my world again, a financial advisor, typically told that you have a target quota of money you have to bring into the firm each 3 months. You'll lose your job, or lose promotion, or lose a bonus that you are otherwise entitled if you don't hit it. You know, the closer you come, but still out of reach of that goal, that quota, and we're going to be talking about that later, the more that can go into a loss frame with predictable consequences. One more thing for the compliance person to put on her list.
And the flip side of that, I think, which is another thing to put on the list, is that compliance and ethics communications framed around loss could be, you know, particularly powerful. Mm-hmm. And I saw this recently at a client organization where the CEO, who seems possessed by fear of these things, wrote a very strong communication to the people, to his employees, about how grave a loss could be for violations. He says, think of all we've built, think of all we've created here. And I thought, though, you know, you don't quite see it that way in most communications of this type. And to me, this, you know, had sort of the ring of behavioral ethics power to it.
Good.
So, Carsten, can you talk a little bit about some of the ways at your company you have cultivated a culture of honesty and ethics? Some of the things that you've done and put into play.
Well, one thing that we try to avoid is to frame things in terms of rules, of monitoring, and of threatening people with sanctions for transgressive behavior, and instead really base our initiatives on an assumption that is essentially the very antithesis to the assumption on which compliance management is based, which is that essentially we as persons lack intrinsic internal resources to exercise ethical agency, if you will, and therefore we need an external authority, a leader, an ethics and compliance department, etc.
So you assume that the employee is an ethical being in the first instance?
Exactly. We start based on the assumption of saying, okay, we believe people have the capacity for ethical agency. And the question is, what are the contextual requirements for actually helping people to fully self-actualize that capacity. And I think it's very interesting to engage in this mental exercise of what a compliance program, or maybe it's could better be called an ethics, a humanist, positive ethics or integrity program would look like. And I think it would take a very different form. I think one of the first things that you would do, so you recognize that intrinsic motivation for ethical agency as a potential resource for organizational governance. So people have values, you invite them to bring those values to work and bring them to bear in decision making. So what's very important is, first of all, that the values of the company and the values of employees are aligned. And how do you do that? Well, I think the best, most effective way is to make sure that company values reflect employees' values rather than the opposite way, which I think is a prevalent approach often. So I think it's very good to have to actually engage, to have employees participate in the process of defining company values, and to iterate that process from time to time so that people feel that their personal values are actually reflected in that. And then secondly, I'll talk maybe now about training and communication initiatives. We focus training really on the idea of providing people with strategies, effective strategies and tools to support and augment that capacity for ethical agency. So for instance, we try to tell them or engage them in a dialogue and a reflection about how they can constructively intervene when they have that feeling of uncertainty. Is this potentially ethically dubious, the decision that's being discussed here right now? How can they engage in a conversation that's not threatening to the other side and hopefully can lead to a positive outcome? That's part of our training. And then to familiarize them with the various tools that the company provides in actualizing that ethical agency. So
what are some of those tools?
It really, well, so one is, of course, the various resources that exist within the organization. And for instance, compliance very often tends to focus on this siloed compliance channel and forgets about other sources of what in collective efficacy literature is called institutional or public sources of control. So institutional sources of control are sources such as in the community environment, it's churches, it's local businesses, etc. In the business context, it would be institutions that are not primarily tasked with ensuring governance, risk, compliance, but that nonetheless have an important stake and can be valuable allies. So here you could think of human resource departments, managers, of course, also potentially employee representatives. So we engage them, employees in a dialogue about how they can make use of these resources, and we engage in dialogue with these departments and people to make them understand that they can be valuable and should be a valuable resource to employees as well. But what I want to point out is that really this really changes the tone of the conversation from something that could be perceived as threatening, and which then will lead automatically, and learning theories support that, will lead to defensiveness and alienation, and to change it into a mindset where people actually feel supported, and we measure the impact or the effect of our training initiatives, for instance, with employees, and we get above 80, sometimes above 90% of approval ratings for the learning experience of our employees.
So by inviting the employee to the conversation and having them sort of speak about what their values are and
by really focusing the conversation on saying or convey, we believe in your capacity to be an ethical agent and to contribute towards maintaining shared social norms in this organization, and how can we help you to do that? Rather than saying, okay, these are the rules that the company defined, we'll monitor your behavior, and if you transgress, we'll punish you.
Excellent.
Just ask on that. I mean, it sounds genuinely wonderful. What I want to understand is this approach used in lieu of some of the basics in terms of, say, anti-corruption compliance or competition law compliance. There are things to call it blocking and tackling, but whether it's having certain kind of procedures, pre-approvals, auditing, monitoring around, say, particularly anti-corruption compliance, which, I mean, I could see that for 99% of the employees, maybe you don't need those, but as my mentor Joe Murphy once said, criminal conspiracies are not decided by majority vote.
Right.
And that they, those couple of people can sort of bring the house down.
Yeah. I mean, as I think all large international corporations and not national corporations, we of course have our, our enforcement mechanisms, and they consist of, audit activities and the like. But I think it's just important to understand that there is a trade-off. You can maximize these control activities, and I think the prevailing trend currently, as I perceive it, is to move more towards what we talked about it, to move towards the panopticon, where the company really sees everything, monitors everything. Doing that on one side, and people's perception of trust by the organization in their capacity to act ethically, and as a function, extension, their commitment to the organization, all of which are things that are necessary for people to care about the organization and to want to invest themselves into maintaining values. So the more we audit, the more we control, the more we promote a mindset of unreflected just obedience and not intrinsic responsibility. So I think we are confronted with a choice.
And so I'm going to ask you, Jeff, what are some things that you have found to be particularly effective in compliance training?
Oh, well, actually, I'll tell you sort of kind of a funny story to start that, and then about something that was singularly ineffective.
That was my second question.
Right. I've
Start
long
that.
thought of the overarching lesson of behavioral ethics as being we're not as ethical as we think. There's more to it, but that certainly captures a lot of it. And so for a large manufacturing company, I had an engagement which required me to write their ethics newsletter every quarter. And they seemed happy, or at least not unhappy, with everything I did for a number of cycles. Finally, I decided to introduce behavioral ethics into this, and I said, and I described the perception, or the view, we are not as ethical as we think, so we need to be more effective, need to get help, need to do the following things. And the client just crossed that out with a big red pen, which I thought was fascinating. And well, it showed they were reading it, which I guess. But it also, at the end I was hurt, but at the end I thought, well, that sort of raises an interesting point, which is the science doesn't necessarily tell you, I mean, it can give you some ideas what to do, but it's trickier than that, because the fact that we're not as ethical as we think, maybe that's not something that you want all employees to think. Maybe it's easier for them to go with their gut, even if it's a imperfect gut. Maybe that's better than putting a big question mark over all of it. But anyway, so that's what doesn't work. What I've seen that does work best is stories. And there's some literature on this. At least years ago, I think somebody named Will Taylor, or something close to that, it's been a while. It shows that people do remember stories. And if we think, and particularly video stories, and if you think of the way you'll remember, at least this is how it works for me. I mean, I'll remember scenes from movies I haven't seen for 35 years. Much more than I'll remember my kids' birthdays and other things. But we do really remember movies and images, and particularly stories. And so what I've seen work, and I don't know if this is from behavioral ethics insight or just more generally, is I've seen stories work well. And the Bible's a bunch of stories.
Right. So, Professor Langevoort, we've actually just heard two very different approaches. One is sort of, watch out, you're not as ethical as you think. And the other is holding an employee to a higher level and saying, you are ethical, you're very ethical, and sort of setting the standard for them to believe that they should act in a certain way. What are you finding in your research as to sort of where you fall between those two?
Yeah, to me that's the conundrum that everybody in compliance faces, which is, it's probably the case, sociopaths aside, that people will not cheat to the level that forces them to stare in the mirror and say, I see a cheater. The cheating is normalized, rationalized, but that can be an awfully big space. And the more you are hands-off and try to inculcate the values and from the top speak the values, but don't address the risk of rationalization, hypocrisy, and things like that, the more you're setting yourself up for situational failure. That is to say, the storm could come in a way that pushes people to stretch the boundary of rationalization and normalization in the direction of corruption. So I've always wanted to find a way to have a hands-off, we trust, these are our values. But before I'd be convinced in any given company that that's a risk worth taking, somebody's going to have to tell me a lot about the company's situation, its competitive environment, the variety of situational factors that could push something off kilter and thus require a more aggressive, if not quite panopticon, type of interaction. You know, all compliance is firm specific. To suggest that there are things you build for everybody, unless you're talking about a high level of generality. I could list 7 things, so can the organizational sentencing guidelines, 7 things that every compliance system ought to have, and I would agree, everyone ought to have it, but they're so general. So it's a long-winded way of coming back to a point that's been made many times, which is behavioral ethics literature has its optimistic side, but it also has its pessimistic side. And I think good compliance people have to be aware of both sides and not get caught up in the celebration. And that has
but I think it's hard. I don't know how many. Who are the practitioners? I was doing compliance, so I was doing the white space for a long time, and then this year I invited someone in to. We did 2016 as a year of ethics because we've done enough compliance, and he showed that egg in a different form, but it was like 85% is gray, and I was like, oh man, 3 years of training down the tubes,
Yeah.
right? Because he was saying it's okay. We know that 85% of life is in the gray, and good people do bad things, and bad people do good things. I was like, oh man. And I guess that it's true. And we saw 2 versions of the egg this morning. That one where the gray space was actually pretty small. If he had shown that egg, I'd have been okay. But he was basically suggesting the context was everything, and most of what we see is gray. And I was sort of bummed out.
Yeah, and just to use an example from my world.
Speak up.
Yeah.
Oh,
go ahead. Go ahead.
Were you referring to my egg?
Yeah.
I was suggesting that there's a lot less gray than you think.
That's what I'm saying. Like that's what I'm saying.
He
Because
wanted
I'm
your
not a saint. I'm not arm wrestling with the devil.
There's a lot of
But
similarities.
I tend to believe that there's a lot less gray. And he started with your first egg and left with your first egg. That there's a 15% Mother Teresa and there's 15% Hitler, but most other people are living in 85%.
Yeah.
And I thought, man, that's a lot of gray.
Obviously, you know, you have to ask who are we talking about and what are they facing. Again, to come back to my world of a financial advisor dealing across the kitchen table with an elderly couple. It all comes down to something called informed consent. And if you think a person with a financial incentive to sell and quotas to meet can objectively assess the consent of the 85-year-old couple across the table without self-serving inference, I'm not going there. So that's where I want some backup, some infrastructure. But there are lots of eggs and lots of colors.
I have a question over here. I have a more structural question. When we're talking about compliance and the
unwanted behavior within an organization, what happens when the structure of the system is out of whack? I'm thinking of the insurance industry where, you know, we could be as ethically as we want, we're gonna be out of business next year because, and you know, after the 70s, they took away the firewall between the people selling the claims and the people fulfilling the claims. And now, that's how you stay in business. So what do you do then?
Again, that's, in terms of how much do we trust, how much do we verify, I guess to use the famous distinction. Certainly, the more moral wiggle room there is, I think the more you have to say this is structural. And so a variety of financial reforms, including insurance or the demise of Glass-Steagall in financial services and things like that, essentially said, we're going to trust the market, competition, to diminish the scope of opportunism. Well, I think any psychologist in the room would say, you know, competition and that fear of demise, mythic or not, is much more likely to drive compliance problematic behavior than solve it. So,
I'm gonna take a question in the back.
In the back.
Yeah, I really want to kind of push back on that paradigm if I can.
Sure.
One of my first consulting assignments was a convenience store chain company. You had 150% turnover at the store manager level. All the reasons you might think of turned out to be wrong. The reason was they gave them a lie detector test every month. And after a while, they said, well, somebody must be stealing around here. Maybe I'll try it. Right? Another big example, I did some consulting for Merck, one of the big pharmaceutical companies. One of my slides said, big, huge, 150-point font, tell the truth. They censored it. Too dangerous. And my point is that the alternative here is not do nothing hands-off versus compliance. It's get an aggressive ethics program. My experience is that there is a disconnect. There's a disincentive between the more you push on compliance, the less you find powerful ethics. I have seen financial advisors who believe in an approach to their business that is customer first, and the last thing they do is pervert their customers' good for their own short-term benefit. And finally, I'd suggest we do a lot of things that look like trust or ethics violations are just bad management. If you have somebody who's given a 3-month incentive and they interpret that in the narrow 3-month terms, therefore I must do this, you have A, a bad salesman, and B, a bad sales manager. Because that is short-term optimization. The worst way to generate brand name long-term customer service is to focus on a 3-month narrow window. Fire the manager, fire the salesperson, reinstitute a better strategic way of viewing business. It's not even an ethical issue. So,
yeah, we could have a very long discussion of this. There's a lot that you said I agree with completely, and in all my work in financial services, aggressive ethics program is a constant hammering. Hammer's the wrong word when you're talking about ethics. A constant attention is where you start. The remainder of our hour conversation would be looking at the universe of financial advisors and the various, there are certainly lots who fall into your category, no doubts.
Yes, go ahead.
Dr. Dan Ariely's not here, but I'm reading his book. It's called The Upside of Irrationality. Some of you guys might have read it. But he did an experiment on how people perform based on incentives. And what he concluded was that incentives work to a certain extent, but if you start paying people a whole lot of money, it creates so much pressure that it actually backfires. And so you guys were talking about, the problem of stress. So this is definitely creating stress just because they're being paid too much. And so having that stress may even cause people to look for shortcuts and stuff like that. And he actually pointed out Wall Street, and he couldn't get Wall Street people to be his subject. And he wanted to. But if you think about it, people get paid so much money, and that creates so much internal stress just because they're getting paid so much.
Yeah, there's a long, and Ariely has a long list of prompts, cues to unethical behavior that certainly include what's on your list.
Right.
That's absolutely right.
You had another question back there?
Yeah, there's some interesting research that suggests that it's not trust or control, it's trust and control.
Yeah.
And that actually, they're not substitutes, they can be complementary.
Right.
And how you make the decision to trust and how much freedom you give is an important part of leadership. That you can assess trustworthiness and give more trust to those who are trustworthy and less to those who aren't. And then how you institute controls determines whether people will be engaged or disengaged. Meaning, will they check the box, or will they be actively searching for what's the right thing to do?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because the trust versus control debate has been going on for at least 30 years, and what you're describing is indeed one of the lessons from the research. You know, at the risk of getting into one other category that I think is important, there are high on the list of what I think is going to be an indicator of where the arrow points under your description has to do with legitimacy. Tom Tyler's work on the expressive value, and to the extent the business, the top, can communicate a sense of legitimacy to the demands, to the expectations, you can indeed rely more on the trust side. What I find frustrating, however, is how on the ground, especially in a highly competitive environment, people under a great deal of stress and a great deal of pressure can delegitimize messages that are meant to be, and in fact are, other regarding and socially valuable. It's one of the frustrations.
I would be very,
So we have one more minute left, and so I'm actually going to ask, and you can make your point. If you could each leave us with a point that you would like the participants to hear today, and/or if you want to answer the question, what's the best way to equip an employee to make an ethical decision when handling an issue that's not black or white, but is firmly in the gray?
Okay, I'll take the first of those.
Okay.
Because it's easier. And the point I would make is one that Langevoort made in his law review article, the book chapter, Behavioral Ethics, Behavioral Compliance, and that is, don't expect too much from behavioral ethics in terms of compliance. It doesn't create new tools, it creates smarter ways to use the tools that already exist. But I would say that, and so that's sort of the overarching point, but there's one other point, which is that I think in some ways the research is, the sum of the research is, the whole of the research is greater than the sum of its parts, because the truly overarching point, we are not as equitable as we think, supports the need for strong, not necessarily bigger, but stronger and smarter compliance and ethics programs of all types. So keep that general message in mind, as well as the things on the list that we started to build with you in terms of specific applications.
I will simply give an illustration and stories. Stories are important. Whenever I do a program within in a compliance setting, I always make sure that nearly all of it is about how to spot these flaws in others. With lots of fascinating stories, and people are getting it. Yeah, I've seen that all the time in X. But in the last 5 minutes, you got to turn the mirror around. And you've got to make the point that it can't possibly be that everyone else but you is subject to all of this. You would have made that same choice, and you leave it with that. You leave people with, the ability to say, I might have. That's as far as you need to go. I think when people can get into the habit of that, and it could be me too, you've accomplished something.
Carsten?
And if I understand you correctly, that may suggest that we need to explore our own biases
Yeah.
in the compliance profession and in academia.
Absolutely.
The bias that I perceive to be still very prevalent is to explore much more the dark side, the base side of human behavior. I would advocate in favor for a Copernican turn here, akin to what Maslow and Rogers did for psychology, and try to focus and understand better people's capacity for ethical agency and how we as organizations can lift that up. I'd love to see the literature that proposes that we can maximize trust and control at the same time. What I've read from Bandura, from self-determination theory, for instance, suggests very strongly the opposite. In terms of how can we resolve or help people make better decisions, I would say bring people into the decision process, participation, not just in ethical topics, in everything the company does, everything that affects employees' work lives, and that will enhance the chance that through this process of deliberation, people will also make better decisions in that gray area.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for
So I will see you in October.
Great, wonderful. Thanks.